Something happened last night that you were never supposed to hear about until the right moment. A conversation took place behind closed doors. A decision was made. Someone who has been carrying questions, fears, and emotions finally reached a point where they could no longer pretend that everything was fine. And now, something is moving toward you that may change the way you understand this entire connection. Before you continue, remember that this is a fictional spiritual style message created for reflection and entertainment. It is not a real medical prediction, diagnosis, or medical report, and it should never replace information from a qualified healthcare professional. The story uses the idea of a medical report as a dramatic symbol for truth finally being revealed. You may have felt something unusual lately. Perhaps you could not explain why certain memories kept returning to you. Perhaps you suddenly thought about someone you had tried to forget. Perhaps you woke up in the middle of the night with an emotion you could not name. Maybe there was a strange feeling that something was about to change, even though nothing obvious had happened yet, and then came last night. Last night was different. There was a moment when everything became quiet, and somewhere in that silence, your soulmate was forced to face something they had been avoiding. They had been trying to keep their emotions under control. They had been telling themselves that time would make everything easier. They had convinced themselves that distance could solve what their heart could not solve, but something happened. Something made them stop. Something made them think about you, and suddenly, the story they had been telling themselves no longer made sense. For a long time, your soulmate may have believed they could simply move forward without answering the questions inside them. They may have acted confident. They may have appeared calm. They may even have convinced other people that they had moved on, but appearances can hide complicated emotions. A person can smile while carrying uncertainty. A person can say they are fine while still wondering about someone. A person can walk away physically while remaining emotionally attached to a memory. And that is why the symbolic, medical report in this message represents something deeper, evidence of what has been happening beneath the surface, not a diagnosis, not a prediction about someone's health, a revelation. A truth, a moment when what has been hidden can no longer remain hidden. Your soulmate has been examining their own heart. They have been asking themselves questions they did not want to answer. Why does this person still matter to me? Why do I still remember those moments? Why does hearing their name affect me? Why do certain memories return when I least expect them? Why did I think I was over it when I clearly wasn't? And the most difficult question of all. What if I walked away from something that actually mattered? That question may have become impossible for them to ignore. You may have thought the story was finished. You may have believed the silence meant the connection had disappeared. You may have assumed that because nothing was happening on the outside, nothing was happening on the inside. But silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes silence is where the biggest internal conversations happen. Sometimes people become quiet because they are finally listening to themselves. And sometimes a person has to lose access to something before they understand its value. That is why the title says, "It's over for you." But what is over? Perhaps the old version of the story is over, the waiting without understanding, the guessing, the confusion, the endless questioning, the version of you that kept wondering whether you mattered, the version of your soulmate that kept running from difficult emotions, the pattern that kept bringing the same questions back again and again. That may be what is ending, not your future, not your worth, not your ability to love, but the uncertainty surrounding the connection. Something has shifted, and the symbolic report is arriving because the truth has finally been written down in a language your heart can understand. Your soulmate is not necessarily the person you imagine them to be. That may be the biggest revelation. You may have imagined someone who always knew what they wanted, someone who never doubted, someone who could confidently walk toward you without hesitation. But perhaps your soulmate, in this story, is human. Perhaps they have fears. Perhaps they have made mistakes. Perhaps they have avoided difficult conversations. Perhaps they have allowed pride to speak louder than love. Perhaps they have misunderstood their own feelings, and perhaps last night forced them to confront all of it. Imagine the moment. The room is quiet, the conversation has ended, everyone else has gone about their night, but your soulmate remains awake, thinking. They replay moments, they remember your words, they remember your expression, they remember something you did that seemed insignificant at the time, and suddenly, that small memory carries enormous meaning. They realize that the things they dismissed were not meaningless. They realize that the connection affected them more deeply than they admitted. They realize that moving forward did not automatically mean moving on. And that realization changes everything. There may have been someone around them who asked a simple question, "Are you really okay?" And for a moment, your soulmate did not know what to say, because the easy answer would have been yes, but the honest answer would have required them to open a door they had kept locked. They might have looked away, they might have become quiet, they might have changed the subject, but inside, they knew the question had reached the place they had been protecting. Are you really okay? Are you really over this? Are you really happy? Are you really certain? And eventually, the truth begins to surface. Maybe they are not as unaffected as they wanted everyone to believe. Maybe they have been carrying unfinished emotions. Maybe they have been waiting for the right moment to understand what those emotions mean, and perhaps that moment arrived last night. The medical report in this fictional message becomes a metaphor for an examination of the heart. An examination of memory, an examination of choices, an examination of everything that happened between two people who could not completely erase one another from their minds. And when the results come in, the answer is not what your soulmate expected. The result is, they still care, they still remember, they still wonder, they still have questions, and they may finally be ready to admit that the connection changed them. But there is another revelation: your soulmate is not necessarily coming back because they suddenly discovered that everything is perfect. They may be coming back because they finally understand that perfection was never the point. Real connections are complicated. People grow, people change, people make mistakes, people misunderstand one another, people sometimes need distance to recognize what closeness meant, And perhaps the greatest transformation is not that your soulmate suddenly becomes someone new. Perhaps it is that they stop pretending to be someone they are not. That is the emotional report, the truth beneath the surface, the thing they could not say before. And there is something else you need to hear: you cannot build your life around waiting for another person. You cannot put your happiness on pause while hoping someone eventually figures everything out. Your life is happening now. Your growth is happening now. Your future is being created now. So if this message feels meaningful to you, let it encourage you to choose clarity rather than obsession, choose peace rather than endless guessing, choose self-respect rather than chasing, choose patience rather than panic, because if something is meant to become part of your life, it should eventually meet you through real actions, honest communication, and mutual respect, not through endless uncertainty, not through fear, not through signs that leave you more confused than before. The person in this story may have a realization, but their realization does not become your responsibility. That is important. You do not have to rescue anyone from their confusion. You do not have to convince anyone of your value. You do not have to prove that you are worthy of being loved. Your worth existed before this connection. Your worth exists regardless of what your soulmate decides. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of this entire message. The ending is not about someone else finally choosing you. The ending is about you finally choosing yourself. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you are no longer desperate for an answer. You still care, you still have memories, you still wonder. But you are no longer controlled by the uncertainty. You can breathe. You can move forward. You can allow life to unfold. And strangely enough, that is often when clarity arrives, when you stop forcing an answer. You become capable of seeing the answer clearly. When you stop chasing someone else's attention, you begin noticing your own direction. When you stop asking whether someone will return, you begin asking whether their return would actually be healthy, respectful, and meaningful. That is maturity. That is growth. And perhaps your soulmate is going through a similar transformation. Last night may have represented the end of an old emotional cycle, a cycle of avoidance, a cycle of pride, a cycle of fear, a cycle of pretending, and if that cycle truly ends, something new can begin. But beginning again does not mean repeating the past. If two people ever reconnect, they must reconnect as changed people. They must communicate differently, they must listen differently, they must respect boundaries, they must acknowledge what happened. They must stop pretending that unresolved issues will magically disappear. Love is not simply an intense feeling. Love is responsibility. Love is communication. Love is consistency. Love is respect. Love is choosing honesty when dishonesty would be easier. And maybe that is what your soulmate finally understood. They may have thought love was supposed to feel effortless. Then life taught them that meaningful connections require courage. They may have believed distance would erase emotion. Then they discovered that distance sometimes makes emotion clearer. They may have believed they could forget. Then one ordinary memory brought everything back. Maybe it was a song. Maybe it was a place. Maybe it was someone's voice. Maybe it was a familiar phrase. maybe it was something completely ordinary that suddenly reminded them of you, and suddenly, they were transported back to a moment they thought they had buried. That is how memory works. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears quietly, and when it does, it can reveal emotions that have been waiting underneath the surface. That is why the fictional report matters. It is not a medical document. It is the symbolic paperwork of the heart. It says, the feelings were not imaginary. The memories were not meaningless. The connection left an impact. The person changed. And the old story cannot continue exactly as it was. Something must change. Perhaps that change begins with you. Maybe you stop interpreting every silence as rejection. Maybe you stop treating every delay as proof that you are forgotten. Maybe you stop giving your entire emotional world to a person who has not yet communicated clearly. Maybe you finally understand that uncertainty is not a substitute for commitment. That realization can feel like freedom, and freedom changes the entire energy of a story. You are no longer standing at the door asking someone to let you in. You are standing in your own life. If someone wants to walk beside you, they must approach honestly. If they want to speak, they must speak clearly. If they want to rebuild something, they must participate in rebuilding it. You do not have to carry the entire relationship alone. That is the hidden lesson. And perhaps this is what your soulmate is learning too. They are realizing that wanting someone is not enough. Missing someone is not enough. Thinking about someone is not enough. If they truly want a future, they have to make choices, real choices, visible choices, respectful choices. That is where fantasy ends and reality begins. And perhaps that is why last night felt so important. Something inside them shifted from imagination to realization. They stopped asking, "What if?" and started asking, "What now?" That is a completely different question. What if keeps you trapped in possibility. What now demands action, and action reveals intention. Maybe your soulmate is finally reaching that stage. Maybe they are no longer satisfied with silently wondering. Maybe they want answers. Maybe they want closure. Maybe they want to apologize. Maybe they want to explain themselves. Maybe they simply want to understand what happened. Whatever the next step becomes, allow reality to reveal it. Do not force it. Do not manufacture signs. Do not assume that every coincidence is a message. Let real life speak. Let honest conversation speak. Let action speak, because when someone truly wants to be part of your life, you should not have to decode every movement. Clarity should eventually become visible, and if it does not, that itself is information. You deserve relationships that do not require constant emotional detective work. You deserve peace. You deserve honesty. You deserve people who can communicate. You deserve people who respect your boundaries. You deserve people who value your presence without making you constantly question whether you matter. So perhaps the biggest surprise in this story is not what the report proves about your soulmate, it is what it proves about you. It proves that you survived uncertainty. It proves that you continued growing. It proves that you learned from what hurt. It proves that you are becoming more emotionally aware. It proves that you no longer need someone else's confusion to determine your value. and that is powerful. Maybe you thought the story was about your soulmate. Maybe it was always partly about you. The connection became a mirror. It showed you where you needed healing. It showed you where you needed boundaries. It showed you what you wanted. It showed you what you would never accept again. It showed you how deeply you could care. And it showed you that love without self-respect can become exhausting. Now you know better. Now you understand more. Now you can approach the future differently. And if your soulmate truly has something important to say, let them say it. If they truly want to return, let them show it. If they truly have changed, let their actions demonstrate it over time. You do not need to rush. You do not need to force a conclusion. You do not need to make a decision based solely on emotion. You can wait for evidence. You can ask questions. You can protect your peace. You can listen. You can decide. And perhaps that is exactly what your soulmate never expected. They expected you to remain in the same place. But you grew. They expected you to keep waiting. But you learned to live. They expected your feelings to control you. But you learned to control your choices. And that transformation may be what finally changes the dynamic. Because when two people meet again after growth, they are not meeting as the same people. They are meeting with new understanding, new boundaries, new wisdom, new questions, and perhaps a new opportunity. But opportunity is not guarantee. Remember that. This is a spiritual style story, not a prediction of someone's actual medical condition or future behavior. The real world requires real evidence. If there is an actual medical report involved, only a qualified healthcare professional and the report itself can explain what it means. Never let a spiritual message replace professional medical advice. The deeper message here is emotional. Something hidden is becoming visible. Something uncertain is demanding clarity. Something old is coming to an end. And something new may be possible, but you get to decide what deserves a place in your future. Maybe last night was the night your soulmate finally admitted to themselves that they had been avoiding the truth. Maybe they realized that they missed the emotional safety they associated with you. Maybe they realized that they never properly expressed gratitude. Maybe they realized that pride cost them something important. Maybe they realized that the person they kept thinking about was not simply a memory, whatever the reason. The realization itself can be powerful, because once someone knows the truth about their own emotions, pretending becomes harder, and that is where this story becomes interesting. What happens after realization? What happens after the person admits the truth? What happens when the question changes from, "Do I still care?" to, "What am I going to do about it?" That is the unanswered part. And perhaps that is why you should not rush toward the ending. Let the next chapter reveal itself. Naturally, if there is communication, listen carefully. If there is an apology, look for sincerity. If there is a promise, look for consistency. If there is a reunion, look for mutual respect. If there is silence, do not destroy your peace trying to interpret it. You can love someone and still choose yourself. You can care about someone and still have boundaries. You can hope for reconciliation and still continue living your life. You can believe in meaningful connections without surrendering your judgment. That balance is important, and perhaps your soulmate is learning the same lesson. They may have believed that love meant holding on at all costs. Now they may understand that love also means respecting another person's freedom. They may have believed that saying nothing prevented conflict. Now they may understand that silence can create deeper wounds than honesty. They may have believed that waiting would solve everything. Now they may understand that some things require courage, and courage may be the real message arriving with this symbolic report, not medical certainty, emotional courage, the courage to speak, the courage to apologize, the courage to accept consequences, the courage to admit mistakes, the courage to begin again without pretending the past never happened. And perhaps you need that courage too, the courage to accept whatever reality brings. If the person returns, you can decide. If they do not, you can still heal. If they explain themselves, you can listen. If they remain silent, you can continue. Your life does not end at someone else's decision. Your future does not depend on another person's timing. Your worth does not depend on another person's recognition. That is what is over for you. The old belief that someone else's choice determines your value. That belief is finished. You are entering a different emotional chapter. A chapter where love is not about desperation. A chapter where connection is not about obsession. A chapter where hope does not require abandoning reality. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, your soulmate is facing a similar truth. Maybe they are finally realizing what they lost. Maybe they are realizing what they need to change. Maybe they are realizing what they should have said. Maybe they are finally understanding why certain memories refuse to disappear. But remember, their realization belongs to them. Your healing belongs to you. Do not confuse the two. You can wish them well without waiting. You can care without chasing. You can forgive without reopening a door.